I guess so, yeah.
Okay.
Ooh, look at Maddie. She's glistening right now. She's glowing. She's giving golden hour.
They'll only be there for a few minutes.
Poor Maddie.
Carson's yeah, Carson. Oh my god. Wait, I have to take my.
Ouch. My bug bites hurt so bad.
Be in my 30s. I was like, expression.
You don't want them?
Can you scratch them when it's our balloon?
Yeah.
That's why I had a bunch of
All right. Well, while you guys are getting settled, as you know, each week we've been highlighting like one area of the world and some people that are serving there. We've talked about Serbia and Brazil. Tonight, I wanted to highlight India. I'm going to spare the videos because I talked to our guy in India. He started a church in Hyderabad just a year or two ago. He was one of my students in the Bible school that I teach at in India. So I wanted to just kind of let you know some of the stuff that's going on there. He didn't want to record a video because he was telling me this morning, he goes, my English isn't good enough. And I'm embarrassed and stuff. So it's perfectly good English, but he was just shy. We'll upload some videos of the ministries that he's recorded. He's filmed himself. They go out into the slum areas and they do outreaches in the streets and they do feedings, and he works a lot with the kids and stuff like that. And it's really been some good ministry that he's been doing, so it's really cool. But we've got connected with India about 5 years ago, and I started teaching in a local Bible college. There's actually 5 campuses throughout India that we teach at, and these are students that are coming with the intention to be a pastor. And in India, if you haven't heard and don't know much about what's going on there, persecution is on the rise. So there's a good chance that these people that are in the schools right now, that in the years coming when they graduate and they start pastoring, they're eventually going to be arrested and beaten and perhaps even killed. So they're going into it with that mindset that they know the persecution is coming. And so they want to be prepared to stand fast, knowing they're going to suffer for their faith. It's almost a foregone conclusion in India that you are going to suffer. In fact, in 2019, after we did our conference there, we went and visited. We did multiple conferences in some of the cities. And one of the lead pastors in one of the cities that we had trained up, young guy, probably 28, maybe 30, he was arrested the day after we left. The police came in and raided his house, raided the church office, took all of his computers away and smashed them, and imprisoned him and beat him for 2 weeks. And he came back to us and he says, I'm so glad that happened, because now I can tell the people that I'm teaching to be prepared and be ready. Now I have something to say. And so it was almost like, now I've experienced the cost of following Christ. And now it validates my word to these other pastors and leaders who are coming up, that what they're going to experience and suffer. And so keep them in your prayers. There's ministries. 3 years ago, we were there and we planted the first church in the foothills of the Himalayas. We had the chief of the village get saved. He was one of 5 people in the entire region that got saved. We put him through the Bible school, and then he went back into his village and he planted a church in his village, and he's the pastor. And it's the first church in history in that region of 136 villages that he oversees. And so as the overseer of the region, he's able to now work with people in other villages to help plant churches there as well. So it's an amazing thing, but we had to travel about 4 hours on windy Himalayan roads to get back to his village, and then walk in the last half mile to get to his village. And a beautiful place, and they broke ground, built a church building, and now they have services every week there. So a lot of great things happening in India, a lot of great people. Keep them in prayer for their safety. When we do put information out about India, just so you know, if it goes on social media or whatnot, we usually say something like Southeast Asia. We don't identify the country specifically because of persecution, and we usually don't use full names. So if you ever see posts or things from us, we're very cautious to not be able to identify. It's very rare we'll put pictures up of some of these guys, because the government does watch and the government does look. And then if we travel, they'll look at us and they'll look at our connections through Facebook and whatnot, and they can deny us entry into the country if they think we're coming to evangelize and do ministry. So the government is that strict. The prime minister is a traditionalist Hindu, and so his goal in his I say reign, but in his leadership is to reestablish India as a Hindu nation. In order to do that, he has to drive out the invading Christians, because they look at that as a European religion that came in with Britain and overtook the country, and they have to drive out the Muslims who are up in the northern regions. So you have a lot of conflict, you have a lot of physical battles going on, you have a lot of persecution there, because they're trying to rid India of Western influence, which is what they look at the monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam especially. So keep them in prayer. There are hearts wide open. When I taught at an open outreach on a street one night, there were probably about 200 or 300 people there, and at the end, they don't work like we do in India. We started the outreach at about 9 o'clock at night. They wait for the sun to go down because it's so hot. You think it's hot now. India is worse. So they waited till about 9 o'clock and they started the outreach. I didn't start teaching until about 11:30. I didn't finish teaching till 12:30, and I thought, great, we're done. He says, no, we're going to call and see who wants prayer. Everybody wants prayer. The mindset in India is that I want the holy man to bless me. And these were all Hindus. Almost no believers there. Were a couple hidden believers, but almost all Hindus. And for 3 hours, one by one, they came up and we prayed, one by one with people. So we didn't get out of there till about 4 in the morning. That's the normal Hindu and the normal Indian way of ministry, is it goes all night long. We've had all-night prayer meetings with them where they start praying at again, 9 at night or something, and they don't stop until the sun comes up. They do worship and prayer all night long. They do that at least once a month. So very fervent believers, but some great challenges there. Keep them in your prayers, and I'll upload some videos that Paul has sent us from Hyderabad about the ministry that's going on there. And we'll keep you informed about the Bible colleges. I'm teaching the next 2 Wednesdays with the Bible college in India as well, so keep that in your prayer. But tonight, we are in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4. We spent our first couple weeks in Hebrews. We looked in chapters 1 and 2, and we saw that Jesus is superior. We're looking at Jesus as the foundation of our faith. We started our first week in 1 Corinthians 3. Saw that there is no other foundation that can be laid except that which is Jesus Christ. Christ is the foundation. And we've got to keep a sure and firm foundation and make sure the foundation is secure. And so we've been exploring how Jesus is our foundation. What qualifies him? What makes Jesus a sure foundation? And in the book of Hebrews, that's what he's arguing. And so in chapters 1 and 2, he's arguing that Jesus is greater than the angels. Starts off really in the first couple verses talking about the superiority of Jesus over the prophets. And then he goes into the rest of chapter 1 with Jesus being superior to the angels. And in the Hebrew Old Testament and the Jewish mind, there's nothing higher than the angels in the spiritual realm other than God. Angels were incredibly important, strong, spiritual beings. And so if Jesus is higher than the angels, that's a big statement. And then in chapter 2, it talks about how Jesus is so great because he took on flesh. He became one of us. Even though he's higher than the angels, he took on flesh and became one of us. We looked at what that means and how people have tried to wrestle with that over the centuries. And then last week we looked at chapters 3 and the first part of chapter 4, where we saw that Jesus is greater than Moses. Now again, Moses is one of the other leading figures in Judaism. If angels were great in the spiritual realm, Moses is kind of the pinnacle in the human realm. Who brought the law? Moses. Who's the one that led the people out of captivity and to the edge of the promised land? Moses. Who's the one that God used and wrote the first 5 books of the Pentateuch? Moses. So Moses is a key and massive figure in Old Testament. So if Jesus is greater than Moses, that means Jesus is pretty great. If he's greater than the angels, he's greater than Moses. You don't get much higher than that unless you're God. And of course, we've argued here that Jesus is God himself. So Jesus is great for all of these reasons. As we come to the end of chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 14 tonight. We're going to see that Jesus, now there's a new section that's starting here. And from chapter 4, verse 14, all the way through chapter 10, we're going to be focusing on the high priesthood of Jesus. Now, the high priest is an important figure in the Jewish life. He's the one that goes in on Yom Kippur. He's the one that represents you to God and God to you. He's that representative of God. He's one of the most important people in Jewish communal life. And without the high priest, your sins can't be forgiven, because the rites and the ceremonies cannot be fulfilled. That high priest is essential in the life of a Jewish person. And if Jesus is our high priest, he's even a better high priest than that old system offered. And we're going to look at why that is and what the writer of Hebrews has to say about that. So we're going to start in chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Can I get someone to read those three verses?
Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
Yeah. Now that beginning, the since then, it's kind of like a therefore. Because of what we've just read, because of what we just studied in chapters 3 and 4, how Jesus is greater than Moses in that Old Testament law and that Old Testament system, because Jesus is greater. Now, actually, if you go all the way back to chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession." So he's now bringing this full circle. He's called as an apostle in that sense. He's the sent one by God, just as Moses was, but he's greater than Moses. But now he's also the high priest of our confession. And so we're going to explore that high priest issue there. So he's that one who took on flesh in chapter 2, verses 5 through 18. He experienced all of humanity, verse 18 of chapter 2 tells us. And so he's able to be a compassionate representative. That's the foundation for the next couple of verses. Jesus is one of us. Jesus is a representative of us. He knows us. He's experienced life with us. And so he can do a really good job of representing us. And because of that, it tells us, the first thing we're supposed to do there in verse 14, we're supposed to hold fast to our confession. So the idea of holding fast is it's to grasp or to clutch. That's the same word that's used when that woman comes to Jesus and grabs the hem and grabs onto his garment. And you grab on and you hold these things, you clutch them with intention. When it talks about the ideas, it's to hold faithfully, to live out obediently these ideas that we have and the confession that we have. And so we're to be faithfully and confidently holding on to Christ in our confession in Christ, because he's that high priest who represents us. Because of all that he's done and how great he is in chapters 1 through 4, we hold fast to that confession. And he can sympathize with us there in verse 15. He knows what it means to be human. He was tempted in all ways just as you and I are. He knows what it is to learn and to grow. He knows what it is to be tempted. Although he never fell into sin, he experienced that temptation. And so he knows the weakness of the human flesh. And so he understands our predicament. He understands what we go through. He understands where we are. And so as a high priest who understands us, he can represent us well. Have you ever been represented by somebody that just doesn't know what your situation's like? Maybe you had a boss at work or somebody that was trying to make a case for you, but they really just don't understand what it's like to be you. But Jesus knows exactly what it's like to be in your shoes. He knows the weakness, he knows the struggles, he knows the trials, and so he is a faithful high priest that can sympathize with us. He's on our side. And then the second thing we're to do there in verse 16 is, because Jesus is that great high priest who passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, we hold fast to our confession. And then verse 16, with confidence we draw near to the throne of grace. Now, this is a radical statement for a Hebrew, because the throne of grace is where God sits. It's the dwelling place of God. And in the Jewish mind, that's in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, between those archangels or between those cherubim whose wings cover the mercy seat. That's where the presence of God is focused and centered. And no one goes in there. Except once a year, a high priest goes in, and he makes sacrifice and makes atonement. But no one has access to God in that way. But we, because Jesus is our high priest, we can have confidence, and we can confidently draw near. We can go in. We can encounter fellowship, personal relationship with God in a way that no one else ever could. No other high priest was able to do that. And so Christ has done that work on our behalf. We don't have to try to be good enough. We don't have to try to earn our way in. That way has already been made accessible to us. And so this is talked about in the present tense, meaning it's something that we continually do. We're to continually draw near, continually enter into his presence, and be a part of that experience. Now, before we move on, I want to talk briefly about the Old Testament priestly system. Many of you guys, if you've been around church, you kind of know the Old Testament priestly system, but really the next couple chapters are embedded in Old Testament theology. So lest you think the Old Testament doesn't mean anything to the New Testament, it really does. The New Testament is founded on the Old Testament. And the writer of the Hebrews makes arguments from the Old Testament regularly to show how the New Covenant is superior to the Old. But in the Old Testament, you had a limited priestly system. You had human priests that could only come in one day a year into the presence of God, and they would offer that sacrifice. But that priest, that high priest, had to make a sacrifice for himself first. You guys have all probably heard the stories that if that priest were to enter into that Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and he was not purified himself, he would be struck dead. And so they would tie a rope around his ankle. They had pomegranate bells on around his robe. And if you were outside that Holy of Holies and you were listening in, kind of as soon as those pomegranate bells stopped shaking, you know something's wrong. You know that priest was not worthy and he's dead, and you pull him out by the rope because you can't go in after him. No one has access to that room except the high priest one day a year if he's worthy. So it's a limited system. And you had to do that every year. The whole process had to be repeated year after year after year. And new sacrifices and new offerings were done throughout the year. It was a continual system. And you never fulfilled it. You never met the end of it. You never achieved the end. You always had to do the next step. You always had to work harder. You always had to give more to meet the system's requirements. So as we start talking about Jesus as the great high priest, he came and fulfilled that system so you don't have to do anymore. That's going to be the focus on why Jesus is so great. So in chapter 5, we're going to break it down into a couple of sections here. In verses 1 through 10, we're going to look at the superior qualifications of Christ as the high priest. What makes Jesus a better high priest is that he is more qualified. He's a better fit. He does the job better than the Old Testament high priests. And so we're going to break this down. In verses 1 through 4, would somebody like to read verses 1 through 4?
I'll read.
Yes.
For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And no man takes his honor to himself, but he was called by God, just as Aaron was.
All right. So there are 4 principles related to the office of the high priest. This is a universal principle that all high priests had in common, including Jesus, we're going to see here. First principle is found in verse 1 there, that he is selected from among the people. The high priest is one of us. The high priest was one of Israel, and he was selected from among the people for a special role and a special responsibility. But he was one of us. So Jesus, taking on flesh, became one of us so that he could fulfill that role of the high priest. He's not some stranger coming in to fix our situation. He's one of us to assist us. He's one of us to take care of the situation. And so that high priest comes in, and he's called out from among the people. Second principle, at the end of verse 1, is that he represents the people in matters that relate to God, especially offering gifts and sacrifices. The responsibility of the high priest is to go before God on behalf of the people. If you wanted to bring your sacrifice to the temple, you couldn't just go in yourself and do it. You couldn't bring your little lamb and go to the altar and sacrifice your lamb and pour out the blood. You needed a priestly intercessor to do that on your behalf. And if you went to go on Yom Kippur and wanted to do it all by yourself, impossible. You needed the high priest. Only the high priest could do that. So that high priest had a special role that he would go before God on behalf of the people to atone for their sins, to do that work of covering over their sin by the blood of the Lamb. And any gifts you brought, anything you wanted to give an offering to the Lord, the priest or the high priest had to do that. Now the other priests shared those responsibilities, but the high priest had that special role amongst them. So, in the same way, Jesus represents us to the Father. He's in heaven right now making intercession for us. He's at the right hand of the Father making intercession for us. He represents us. He takes our sacrifices and presents them to the Father. He is our high priest making intercession for us. Now, the third one there is found in verse 2. The high priest, all of the high priests, had to offer sacrifice for their own sins. Now, I know some of you may ask, but I thought Jesus didn't sin. You're right, Jesus didn't sin. So he didn't need his own sacrifice. He was the sacrifice for sin. But because he is sinless, he is accepted before the Father. The one thing that would cause the high priest to be rejected by God was unrepented or undealt with sin in his life. If that high priest went in on Yom Kippur and had not atoned for his own sin first, he would have been rejected and cast out and cast dead by God at that moment. Jesus, having no sin, was able to go in and do that. And so, the idea that he, in verse 3 it says there that he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. And that idea of being beset with weakness is the idea of being surrounded by or engulfed in weakness. In chapter 12, we'll see the same word when we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. You're kind of engulfed and surrounded by this. Now, it's not saying that Jesus himself had a weakness that led to sin. It's saying that Jesus subjected himself to the weakness of the human nature. But he did it perfectly. And so Jesus knows what it is to be weak. And as our high priest, he relates to us and he has compassion for us and he represents us. And he goes before the Father on our behalf. But he had none of his own sin to atone for. So he's a special high priest in that case. And then finally, in verse 4, it tells us that the high priest was appointed by God. No one gave themselves this position. This was not an application that you filled out and you went in and surveyed for and interviewed for and hoped you got the job. Only God appointed the high priest. So if Jesus is the high priest, only God can give him that role in that place. So it's that special role. These are 4 principles that all high priests meet. And we see Jesus meets all those as well. Now in in verses 5 and 6, somebody want to read those 2 verses?
So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek."
Yeah. So he takes that appointed idea in verse 4, that you've got to be called by God, appointed by God to this position, and he says, oh, and by the way, Jesus was actually appointed to this position. and he goes back and he references Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. Now he's already used this verse back in chapter 1, verse 5, when he's showing how Jesus is greater than the angels because Jesus is the Son of God. So he's connecting the deity of Jesus with the role of the high priest by reiterating this verse. Jesus is the Son of God, so he's higher than the angels. He's God himself. Oh, and he's also the high priest because of that godly position. He's appointed by God because he's the Son of God. And then he uses a second passage there in verse 6. He says, "You're a priest forever after the after the order of Melchizedek. This is a quotation from Psalm chapter 110, verse 4. We'll talk about Melchizedek a little bit more in a second. I'm just going to barely touch the surface. Next week we're going to dig into Melchizedek. So if you need to read up on Melchizedek, this would be a good time. So Melchizedek is a special line of priesthood that we'll talk about. So Jesus was appointed to that position. That's what verses 5 and 6 tell us. Now verses 7 through 10. Anybody want to read those? Go for it.
In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Yeah. So how did Jesus come about and fulfilling this appointment? We saw the four universal truths of a high priest. We saw that Jesus was appointed a high priest by God, but he wasn't just given the role, he achieved the role, if you will, through much suffering and trial. He took on flesh, and in his flesh he suffered. In his flesh he offered up prayers and supplication, loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And the idea is that Jesus endured through the suffering in faithfulness to God. He never once walked away from the will of God, never once walked away from obedience to God the Father, never once put his own will first. You guys know when he's praying there in the Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. The idea that, Lord, my will is not to go through this. I kind of would like to avoid the suffering thing. But he says, nevertheless, not my will, but your will. In other words, I'll be obedient to the end to you, Father. And I'll suffer whatever is necessary to accomplish the goal, to be a faithful high priest. And so he achieved that role. He was appointed that role through much suffering. Jesus endured great suffering on our behalf in order to be that one who can relate to us. Verse 8 kind of clarifies that. He says, although he was a son, it seems like he would just rightfully be handed this role. It says, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. He learned to endure. He experienced endurance of suffering. Now, as God, he's not experiencing that. But as man, he's got to experience suffering just in the same way you and I do. And he experienced a greater suffering than many of you and I will ever face. And it says in verse 9 that being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. The idea that in his flesh, he perfectly lived out the will of God. In his humanity, he lived out all that God had called him to do, and he perfected manhood. He was the perfect man in that sense. And so he became that source of eternal salvation for all of us. He's designated a high priest, not after the lineage of Aaron, but after the lineage of Melchizedek.